Sunday. You'll probably be all right.
Okay. I'll just pull up.
No, actually, don't pull up because then you'll be behind the hotel.
Mr. Vidal, what brings you here to Austin?
Well, a book festival brings me here to Boston. To Austin. Sounding like Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Austin and Boston, they both used to say in harmony.
Tell us about your new book.
Well, it's called Point-to-Point Navigation. I was first mate of an army boat in the Second World War in the Aleutian Islands. And we never saw the sun, the moon, the stars, so you could never plot a course properly. So we did what was called point-to-point navigation. You just learn the landscape and hope that you wouldn't hit one of the rocks or reefs along the way.
Is that called Dead Reckoning?
Well, it's dead figures in it quite a bit, yes.
Sir, on the radio we had a chance to talk a little bit about the Military Commissions Act, known as the Torture Bill. Can you give us your perspective historically, being somewhat of a historian on that?
Well, it is as foul as a great deal of other legislation which has been coming out of the White House, which, as it removes our Bill of Rights, is creating a kind of bill of wrongs, that the U.S. can now do to other people, like renditioning people we don't like. We kidnap them, send them to another country, hold them in prisons. We can put them on trial, even if they don't have a lawyer. We can execute them. These are powers that have never been even thought of before by earlier attorneys general and presidents. And it's very scary that it all passes by so simply. Everybody sort of yawns. Well, we've got to move on, we've got to move on. Well, we've moved on into hell. And that is what has happened to the Republic of the United States.
Can you speak to due process? You talked about your grandfather.
Well, my grandfather was the first senator from Oklahoma, wrote the Constitution of the state, and great lawyer. But he always said, I was brought up by him in Washington, and he always said the basis of this country, there's only one basis. It's very simple. It's 3 words. Due process of law. You cannot deprive somebody of liberty. You can't deprive him of his money. You can't deprive him of his life without there being due process of law. Now, this weird Attorney General and this even weirder President have decided that as Commander-in-Chief, the President has certain inherent powers. Well, I'm here to tell you and your listeners there are no inherent powers at all that accrue to the President of the United States. He has enumerated powers which are listed in the Constitution itself, and it takes about 5 minutes to read them, and that's that. The President does not have the power to declare war on another country, which he did by going into Iraq and making a god-awful mess. Also, he knocked down much of Afghanistan just because he felt like it and because nobody would stop him.
You talked about the death of the Republic, that you never thought you'd live to see the end of the Runnymede tradition. Can you speak to that?
Well, Runnymede is where Magna Carta was signed by King John several hundred years ago, and Magna Carta is the basis of all of our liberties and has been ever since we were a colony of England, and when we became an independent republic. It is still the basis of all of our law, and the biggest part of it is habeas corpus, and that has been removed by USA Patriot Act and other pieces of legislation which should be burned.
You spoke about some of your questions concerning 9/11 and how your father had helped write some of the rules for intercept. Can you speak to your questions concerning 9/11, please?
Well, there was a big story about in the India Times, which is a very good newspaper, and it was about 9/11. And we had just found out, the world had found out, that Mohammed Atta, who was a Saudi Arabian guy, but seemingly working for Osama bin Laden, as far as anybody knows, that's probably true, that he was in charge of the planes that crashed into the New York buildings. Well, the story is really more complicated. What struck me immediately, my father was director of air commerce under Franklin Roosevelt. My father, who was one of the original Army Air Force flyers in World War I, he had put in a lot of sort of safety things. In the event of a hijacking of a passenger liner or any plane that they knew about, that fighter planes would be scrambled, that is, sent up into air immediately within minutes in order to force the plane down, to change course, shoot it down if you had to. And you don't need orders from the president, the vice president, or anybody else. That's the law. Well, they didn't go up after 9/11. Everybody knew what had happened, and the planes were still on their way to Washington to hit the Pentagon, when suddenly from Otis Air Base comes one fighter plane. Otis Air Base is in Massachusetts. Might just as well have been in Canada. That was the only fighter plane which, according to law, they all should have been up there, and not one went up. Well, that could only happen if somebody had told them to stand down, not to respond to what was, after all, their sworn duty. That's the Times of India broke the story, and then that well-known radical rag, the Wall Street Journal, also wrote about it. I thought by then places like the New York Times would have waked up, but the New York Times is incapable of waking up to anything important.
And then last question, sir, can you speak to election fraud in the book that you worked with a congressman on concerning election fraud?
Oh, John Conyers, who's a congressman from Detroit. He went up he's the ranking Democrat of the Judiciary Committee of the House, and he'll be head of the committee should the Democrats take back Congress. He went up with a team of researchers to Ohio not long after the election, and they went all around the state, and they interviewed everybody. They found many, many cases of particularly electronic machinery that had been hacked in order to reverse votes. And they made a book out of it. I wrote the preface to the book. It's very persuasive about what happened. The New York Times would not review the book or mention it, nor would the Washington Post review or mention it. As far as I know, the only well-known paper in the country was the Boston Globe that gave it a tiny review. What's going on? To what extent is the media totally subservient to corporate America, which is up to a lot of mischief electorally all around the nation?
Is President Bush, we know he's announcing the powers of dictators. Can you just briefly speak to that and what it means to have someone announcing the powers of dictatorship, and where you think this country's going?
Well, it's going over the cliff. That's very clear. I think what we can't endure much longer is the emptying of the Treasury. It's trillions of dollars now have gone for these two insane wars in the Middle East. And that money isn't going to come back. The people killed are not going to come back. It's going to take a generation at least of very, very good luck to get back to where we were before 9/11 and the Bush coup d'etat.
In closing, Mr. Vidal, do you have hope for America, people starting to rouse and wake up? And can you specifically speak to Bush attempting, his quote about it'd be better if this was a dictatorship?
Well, I think he thought he was making a joke. And certainly he is a joke, but he's a very sinister joke who's caused a lot of trouble.
How much is an individual a product of their society and their government, and how does one keep from being a product of your society and government?
Well, you are who you are. You are what you know.
Right.
What you know is all important. It is very difficult to be well informed because we have the most secretive government on earth.
Right.
And if you want to find out what's going on in the U.S., read the foreign press. I learn a great many things that I'll never find in the New York Times,
Right.
which is a company paper.
Right. progressive in August that it would take 2 to 3 generations from now for the U.S. to return to the way it was 20 years ago in terms of laws and, government, and personal freedom of the individual. What did you mean by that?
I meant exactly what I said. Look, you don't throw away the Bill of Rights of a country like this, which has nothing else to cling to. The Bill of Rights is the United States. It is the Republic. It is the formula, the secret formula. Throw that out, and you don't have a country. We now see, we have presidents that don't get elected anymore. And nobody seems to bother much, but they should start bothering.
You're also multiple times quoted as saying that Americans are familiar enough with their history, and what do you recommend to Americans? Because in order to maybe learn more about their history, how do you encourage Americans to do so in this?
Go to the library. Learn how to read. This is a curious country,
Right.
We have more good writers than we've got good readers.
Right. How do you create an environment that encourages people to learn about their history, or is that on the person themselves?
Well, if they don't have the curiosity, they're never going to have it. So. Tiberius, when he became emperor, the Senate sent him a message saying that whatever he wanted enacted would become law.
Right.
And he sent it back to them. He said, "Don't be stupid." He said, "Suppose the emperor has gone mad. Suppose he's ill.
Right.
Suppose he's been replaced secretly. You can't give such powers."
Right.
And they sent it back to him. And he sent back a message, how eager you are to be slaves.
Right.
But the people are starting to fight slavery, aren't they?
Magari, as we say in Italy.
What would you recommend to young people nowadays in order to keep themselves from being slaves?
Well, the more you know, the less likely you are to be enslaved. So they should start reading and thinking.
Are young people nowadays slaves, do you feel?
Don't know that many.
All right. Let's see here. This is the Texas Book Festival, and it was founded by Laura Bush. You do have an opinion of the Bush administration, and I was just wondering, did you feel any conflicts coming here, or?
No, I separate her from the
right.
administration.
What are you hoping for in the next presidential election?
Well, anything to get rid of this regime. That's mandatory. I am not one of those people who believes everything will be all right if we can just get a nice man or a nice woman in the White House. It doesn't work like that. What's wrong is systemic. We need a lot more thought about our arrangements electorally and intellectually.
So, your memoir is about to be released. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
The title is Point-to-Point Navigation.
Right.
Which is what you do when you can't use your compass.
Right.
Because the weather was so bad in the Aleutians.
Okay.
And it's my last 40 years.
What are some highlights from the last 40 years? What are some highlights from the last 40 years?
Mostly lowlights.
All right. What are some lowlights?
Death, but not transfiguration.
Okay.
Mr. Vidal, I had one question I forgot to ask you. You had called for a new 9/11 investigation on the radio, saying we'd find something, or we might. Can you speak for the camera to that?
Am I plugged in?
Yes, sir. I've still got my mic on you.
I think one advantage of having a Democratic House of Representatives after the coming election will be that we can have a new commission investigate 9/11 and the events leading up to our attacks on two innocent countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. It's about time that we began to clean up our own house before we find that an international tribunal has summoned our leaders to The Hague in chains to put them on trial.
So obviously you don't like the investigation of the Bush appointees?
No, I don't. A couple of them were pretty good individually, but the report is...
Well, I mean, how could the media call it an independent commission when it was appointed by Bush?
Who cares what the media says about anything? They are bought and paid for 1,000 times over. They couldn't tell the truth if they could find it.
But they are losing their market share to the alternative media.
They're losing a lot of things. They're losing their readers, their viewers, their listeners, you know. There are big changes coming.
Big changes?
Big changes.
Well,
Good for the people or bad for the people?
Depends.
what do you think those changes are?
The collapse of the newspaper culture.
Right.
New York Times is losing advertising, for which we can be grateful. It's a smaller paper.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Let me just get this microphone. And again, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.